I think these days the definition of a successful life has become more complicated, and back then it really was a matter of if you can possibly buy the house and pay it off and not be in prison. Well done you.
From Mamamia, I'm Mrs. Jason Levine, and you're listening to No Filter, candid conversations that count. Did that sound a little weird to you? Well, yes, it is very weird actually. I am Mia Friedman, and I just used my husband's name to introduce myself and this podcast. But in the 70s, doing that was not weird at all. It was pretty normal actually, as was smoking during pregnancy and sacking women from their jobs as soon as they got married. Being legally allowed to rape a woman if you were married to her, that was normal in the 70s. So was removing children from their mother's custody if she had an affair. Also, teachers hitting children with sticks at school was called getting the cane. And it was also pretty common to call gay people, trans people and migrants horrible defamatory names. And if you wanted to, you could pinch a woman on the bum at work. That's how the not-so-olden days used to roll. And that's what my guest today wants us to remember. Richard Glover is an award-winning writer and broadcaster who knows a thing or two about the 70s because he grew up in them. And now he's written a book about that time called The Land Before Avocado. He also reckons that in a world that is now dominated by technology, we often look back on the 70s and 80s with rose-coloured glasses. We used to climb trees instead of look at screens all day, we say. We roamed the neighbourhood until it was dark and nothing bad happened to us, we say. We had to crawl to school over broken glass in the snow and we turned out all right, we said. But is that really true? Richard Glover says no, and he's very funny and fascinating when he says it. Richard, I bloody loved this book.
Oh, good.
It was different to what I thought it was going to be.
Did you think it was going to be more optimistic about the past?
Yes.
More nostalgic?
But I shouldn't have, because the last time we spoke, it was about your book, Flesh Wounds, which I absolutely loved. And I remember two lines in it that stuck with me so much when I read it. It was a memoir about your childhood. And you talked about your upbringing in the 60s and the 70s. And you said there is a nostalgia for the past. And the kids used to just run around and they used to run in the woods. But sometimes there were pedophiles in the woods and no one believed the kids. And I remember reading it, and it was the first time that had been articulated to me, because as a parent myself, I also fall in the, I grew up in the 70s and we used to run around and we just had to be home by dinner, and now we're just helicoptering over our children and they can't leave the front yard. Was that the kernel of the idea for this book?
Yeah, in a way, if Flesh Wounds was my story, this is everyone's autobiography that they didn't get round to writing, I suppose.
Yeah.
It's about the realities of that period. I do think that, they say the history is written by the winners, the history of the First World War. Well, the history of this period is written by the survivors. So, yes, it was great fun if you had an uncle with a farm and he put all the kids in the back of the ute and you did circle work in the paddock and the kids flew from one side of the tray to it. But some kids did fall out and smash their heads open. And it was great fun if you went and played in the fields and came home when mum banged the dinner pail and all. But some kids did get lost in those woods. And the woods it was a paradise for pedophiles, actually, the Australia of this time. So part of the reason I object to this demonisation of helicopter parents for so many reasons. One, because I don't really know any. I'm sure there are some people who overdo it, but most people I know, most young parents I know, this is a Sydney example, most young parents I know are thinking, George Street Friday night, 14, 15 or 16, I don't know, where is it? They're actually, and I don't know the answer to that, they're making, no one's saying, they're not allowed to go until they're 25, nor is anybody I know saying, let them go when they're 11. They're making these nuanced quality decisions. People talk about the parents of the past as if they were allowing their children to roam through the suburbs after making some very rational assessment of risk. And in order to build their children's resilience, we'll allow them to go. No, they just didn't. They just didn't care. Now, this is not an attack. I don't think that's true of all parents. There were some attentive parents back then, of course. But it's also not an attack on those parents. There's some data in this book. They got married when they were 21 on average. The first child is when they're 23. They're kids themselves. They've been through the depression, the older ones. They have got other things on their mind. So you have this very underparented generation of kids. That's the kind of truth of it. The difference between, I always think that, one of the measures of this period is the difference between the good father and the bad father. Both fathers put the kids in the back of the Holden and take them down to the pub on a Saturday afternoon and park the car in the sun whilst they go inside and get hammered for 3 hours. The good father is the one who remembers halfway through the drinking session to go out and pop a lemonade through the window. That's the good father.
That's a good dad.
And both the good father and the bad father then drive the kids
home, half pissed.
Totally pissed.
Totally pissed. I want to come back to parenting in a moment, but before that, I want to just describe the cover of your book to people because it's so genius. It's called The Land Before Avocado, and on the front there's a beautiful piece of toast that just looks so delicious and ready to be buttered. And it's sort of golden brown and all perfectly toasty. But then on the back, it's burnt. And I thought the back of the book and the back of the toast, and I loved that idea of our memories of a time can be very golden and through rose-coloured glasses. But in fact, there is a seedy and often burnt underside. And the place I want to start is with women. And I don't think there are a lot of women who'd say, gee, it was so much better for women back in the 60s and 70s. But it was quite shocking even to me, who I know my stuff. Some of the timelines that you describe, paint me a little bit of a picture about the life of women in the 60s and 70s and how long it took for some proper change to happen.
Well, I think the Australia, obviously there's good things to the Australia of the time. We'll talk about the Australia of that time. We'll talk about those later. But it is a very hard place to be different in any way. And different can include being a straight man, but not of a particular kind. It can involve being Aboriginal. It can involve being ethnic. It can involve being gay. And it can involve being a woman. So this is an Australia where until 1966, for instance, you get sacked as a married woman the instant you get married from the public service. So the Australian public service is full of women who are hiding a wedding ring, hiding a married name, hiding a pregnant belly under a loose blouse in order to eke out another couple of weeks more employment before the inevitable happens.
Because there was the idea that you had to make room, that your husband would support you, and you had to make room for single women and married men.
The Cabinet actually debates it because the English have got rid of it decades before. And the Cabinet just debates it and they say, we do not want to come between a wife and her wifely duties. Once she's got married, she has to go home. We don't want her in the workforce. Now, you'll say 1966 is a long time ago, so let me try this out on you. Until 1984, a woman has to get her husband's signed permission before she can leave the country.
I was in high school by then.
1984, that's when the Sex Discrimination Act comes in and that is outlawed. But you can't get a passport without your husband's. There's some stuff in the research for this book where when I tell people my age, they say, oh, Richard, why are you even bothering putting that in? Everybody knows that. And I'll tell the same thing to a younger person, to a millennial, and they'll say, I don't believe you, you're lying. For instance, in the Woman's Weekly of the period, right through the early 70s.
Which is almost like a document of record for women's lives in a way, been.
It's selling 800,000 copies or something. It's huge. You really cannot work out the first name of any married woman using that as a source. She is always called not only by her husband's surname, but by his first name as well. So even someone quite famous like Sonia McMahon, who's a great socialite and wife of the Prime Minister, she is always Mrs. William McMahon. And she's always photographed in these pictures with Mrs. Bert Carruthers and Mrs. Bill Smith. It's a very gender-fluid world. All the women are called Barry and Bert. And,
in an English magazine, I think it might be Tatler, they still do that in the social pages sections. It's Mrs. James Smith and Mrs. John Brown.
As if your total value is installed in your husband.
And in actual fact, it was in terms of the power he held over controlling your life, right?
The Weekly is really an interesting thing because actually the articles are quite intellectual. I was somewhat surprised by that. You come across articles about this new English politician, Mrs. Margaret Thatcher. She seems to be doing well. A great profile of Jackie Weaver, an article on the population bomb by Paul Ehrlich. There's quite intellectual articles. And then from the advertising seeps this incredible sadness. All the ads are for, and I suppose some of this is true today, but the ads are just so much about diet pills, pills that promise to remove your inner smells, weird stuff like that. There's an ad in the book, Ford pills. Ford pills let you... What does it say?
It says Ford pills can help make you as attractive as the girls your husband stares at in the street.
Okay, let me read the small print, though. The small print's even better. Looked at him recently, not as a husband, but as a man. Looked at yourself, not as a wife, but as his secretary. Don't turn away from what you see. Start fighting. Get some Ford pills. Do you know what Ford pills are?
They're laxatives.
They're laxatives. So you might get your husband back, but make sure you're near a toilet at the time.
Wow.
And there's Bex and there's Vincent. And
what was Bex? That thing about have a Bex and a good lie down.
Yeah.
What was Bex?
Yeah, so they're compound analgesics, and for some reasons Vincent's was slightly more middle class. Bex
So they're like tranquilizers?
No, they're kind of headache pills, I suppose, but they destroy your kidneys. And at the point that they're banned, the rate of kidney disease among Australian women drops by, I can't remember, 2/3 or something. They cause fatal kidney disease, yet people are taking these in vast quantities, taking Valium in vast quantities as well. So, you have this society...
Because women were bored, they couldn't work, they were in marriages they couldn't escape. Let's talk about that, because with the Ford pills thing, as outrageous as it is, that idea about your husband going off with his secretary... If that happened, you were stuffed because you'd probably never worked because you weren't allowed to, and you had his name, you had no financial means of supporting yourself, and you couldn't even get a divorce.
I mean, the book bounces from things that I think are quite funny to things that are really quite bleak. It's like any travel book, really.
Yeah.
It's like a travel book to a very different, weird land. In this case, it's our own country, but a few decades ago. Until January 1976, there's no such thing as no-fault divorce.
Can you explain what that is?
So no-fault divorce brought in by the Whitlam government's what we have now. Before then, to get a divorce, you have to prove one of 14 causes for a divorce. Most of them are things like adultery or cruelty. Mostly it's adultery. But you need to prove them. It's not enough to bring a letter from yourself and even the husband and even the co-respondent, as they were called. So you could have, say the husbands had the affair.
Yep.
You could have letters from all of you, all three of you saying, look, the marriage is broken down. He's off with, June. We want a divorce. The judge will not accept that. You need independent proof. Now, proof means you need to hire a private investigator who will either fake this up or do it for real, but break in at the time the sex is occurring, take some photographs. So,
Stop it.
Yeah, and then present them to the judge.
And the judge got to decide who could divorce and who couldn't divorce. You had to be granted a divorce.
That was the word they used, granted, actually.
And someone had to be at fault.
Yeah, that's right. And so anyone can go and access these records. In each state, there's state archives. You can go in New South Wales. There's kilometres. It's the saddest place in the world. There's kilometres of these leather-bound volumes.
What are some of the stories that you saw?
Well, they're often 60 or 70 pages long. And, and they all follow the same pattern. The private investigator is being interviewed by the judge for the man. Or what did you see then? Well, I went into the bedroom. What did you see? I saw the co-respondent getting out of the bed. What was she doing? She was attempting to put on her slacks.
How creepy.
And then there would be photographs which would be presented to the... Look, I had a very sad week there. The saddest of all was a case which, again, it was going on for about 60 pages. This woman was basically pleading with the judge to have a divorce. The husband had agreed that the adultery had occurred.
He'd been having affairs.
They even had the letter. Yeah, adultery, it's a very old-fashioned term. But yeah, he'd been having an affair with Joan or June, or she'd agreed as well. The wife is begging. And the judge says, look, I cannot just take this. And he actually quotes, there's a bit where he says, look, the Chief Justice has only just repeated to us that we can't take this stuff on people's say. We need independent proof. Otherwise, anybody could get a divorce just because they wanted one. I mean, how outrageous would that be? At this point, after about 60 pages, he says, well, I imagine him leaning back. I don't know if he leant back, but I imagine him leaning back. And he looked at her and he says, well, anyway, when are you due? And she says, 6 weeks, Your Honour. She's obviously pregnant with the child
Heavily.
of the wayward husband.
Yeah.
And she just really wants to get a divorce from this bastard before the baby is born. And at that point, the judge turns to the woman's lawyer and he says, look, I really want to help this woman. I'm here in Wollongong for another couple of weeks. And he says to the lawyer, just bring me something. Try to bring me something. Now, I think he's instructing the lawyer, go and dodgy something up.
Yeah.
Get a private investigator to sign a letter, and I'll try to make the most of it. But that's the sort of reality of it. It's a very difficult place if you're trying to do anything that is not right down the norm.
I don't need to go and look at records. I just need to have a conversation with my mother to know about that. She got pregnant when she was a teenager, and because there was no abortion in the 60s, she had to get married at 17 to the father of the child, who was also 17. And after a couple of years, after having my brother, she wanted to leave the marriage. He was lovely. There was nothing wrong, but she didn't love him. She didn't want to be married. She was happy to have a baby, but she didn't want to be married. So they separated, but divorce couldn't be granted for, I think, 5 years. And in that period, she could not be with anybody else. And she went and saw a lawyer, and the proof of adultery, as you said, was just being in the house alone with a man for an hour. That's all they needed. The investigator could take photos of going in and coming out. So she said to this lawyer, he just said, look, you're just going to have to wait for the 5 years out until the time. And she says, I'm 20 years old. Are you saying I have to be a nun for 5 years? And he said, yes. Yeah. Yes, you
Actually,
do.
you know, there was one tiny thing.
Or she'd lose custody automatically. That's the other thing. Women would lose custody if they could be proven to be the adulterous ones.
The law said of a man, repeated act of adultery. Of a woman, adultery.
Yes, and this idea
so you had to actually,
Yes.
if you wanted to prove fault on the man's part, you had to prove he'd done it
several times.
several times. If you wanted to prove fault on the woman's part, you had to prove she'd done it once.
And she would lose automatic custody of any children she had. And a friend of my mum's lost custody of her 2 children that way. And it was unimagiable.
The book is full of things.
Tony Abbott, just before we go on.
He wanted to bring it back. Yeah, wanted to bring it back at one point.
Just a few years ago, Tony Abbott said, okay, let's bring back fault divorce. What was his...
He was saying that you should be able to sign up. He wasn't saying it for everyone. He said you should be able to sign up for a marriage in which that's the rule from the start. The book is full of things where, I call the game Let's Shock a Millennial. And you can tell people this and they just will look at you and think, no, when's this? Are you talking about 1590? No, I'm talking about 1975 or I'm talking about 1984. Or
when you and I were alive. Let's talk about what it was like to be gay or lesbian around that time.
My favourite bits in the book, maybe this is my dark sense of humour. I love the bits in the book which will leave you both kind of horrified and hopefully laughing at the same time. For instance, I've got this case which I've come across of John and Lindsay. This is 1974. South Australia's just legalised, but it's the only state to do so, and the rest of the states take a long time to follow suit. John and Lindsay are living...
So being gay was illegal?
It was illegal. And the maximum penalty differs slightly from state to state, but in Victoria, where this story is set, 14 years is the maximum.
So you didn't just cop a fine?
14 years in prison is the maximum sentence. So John and Lindsay are living a very kind of small life. I mean that in the best sense of the word. They love each other and they're really focused on paying off their hire purchase furniture, which is another feature of the day actually. And that's their focus. And someone dobs them in, and the police
For being gay.
And the police knock on the door, and probably because they're just not aware that they're doing anything wrong, because they're not bothering anyone, they're living this little life, suburban life, they tell the truth stupidly. And so they end up in front of the judge, and the judge listens to the whole case. This is 1974, Melbourne. And in the end, he does this plea bargain with them. He says he's going to find them guilty and he's going to fine them, but he won't send them to prison providing they agree to move to South Australia.
Oh
now,
my God.
I've just got
so they're extradited.
I just had this lovely image of 14 years in prison or move to Adelaide. Give me a moment, Your Honour. I love Adelaide, and I hope they move to Adelaide. And good on Adelaide for, hopefully giving them this loving home.
The fact that the court could have jurisdiction over not just your bedroom, but where you lived.
Where you lived.
Based on your sexuality.
Well, it's the only state, you see. And when Tasmania took until the 90s to make homosexuality legal. And I know at the time people said, look, don't make too big a deal of this, because it's just a statute book thing. There's no police actually arresting people, which was true in Tasmania in the 1990s. But back then, these laws are actually being used. There are hundreds of men in particular being arrested every year, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. There's one operation in Melbourne where 114 gay men are arrested in one operation. In Sydney, in the Gay Mardi Gras in 1978.
Didn't start as a party.
First Gay Mardi Gras, they arrest, I think it's 80 people. The Sydney Morning Herald, so again, 1978, it's not long. The Sydney Morning Herald made sure it published the names, occupations and addresses of every single person that was arrested so that everyone would know who these gay people were.
And many of them lost their jobs, lost their livelihoods.
Yeah, and police would often surreptitiously, well, I don't know if often, but there are several cases I know about from this time where police have been unsatisfied with the fine that the magistrate or judge has given, and so have made sure they've anonymously sent the court documents to the bloke's employer, and he is then duly sacked.
With no right of appeal, because there's no anti-discrimination
No,
act.
that's right.
What about gay women around that time? Did you find...
Yeah, well, so it's funny to write about this period because in a way it's full of these great firsts, these great hopeful moments. So the Women of Bilitis, it's called, is the first lesbian organisation, I think, in the world. It's set up in Melbourne in 1969. There's the first Aboriginal tent embassy. There's Anne Summers is setting up the first women's hostel in Sydney. Jack Mundy saving, the Green Band, saving Sydney. And you can tell the story of this period as this sort of enormously optimistic story of these firsts. But, for all these firsts to exist, you can only have the Nimrod Theatre putting on Australian plays really for the first time in 1971, or in Pram Factory in Melbourne in 1971. You can only have that because it's been such a desert up to that point. You can only have Jack Mundy doing the Green Bands in Sydney because in 1971 they were about to bulldoze the Rocks, the home of European Australia. They're about to bulldoze it. You can only have all of these things because the society up to that time has been such a frightened monoculture.
Of white men.
And in a way, I think this is quite a patriotic book. I don't know of many countries in the world which have gone from such a frightened monoculture to what we've got now, not perfect, but what we've got now, amazing, has gone through from that to this in the period of most of our lives. And we are the people, we who are over 50, I suppose, it's happened in the course of our lifetime. And we've been participants in it through our marching and our voting and our talking. And I think seeing it for what it was and seeing the magnitude of the change is in a way to pat ourselves on the back, and also to pat on the back, Anne Summers and the brave men and women of camp and Gough Whitlam and Charlie Perkins and all the other people who've made this amazing transformation occur.
And the 78ers.
And just to sort of ignore that and look at the past as if, it was marvellous, ignores what we've achieved, actually. And it also, it robs us also of another thing, which is to know how much change we've achieved so far is to embolden us to make more changes in the future.
Because there's more to come.
There's more to come, and you realise that all these things were absolutely locked in stone. There's no way you can give a married woman a credit card on without her. There's no way you could knock out the White Australia policy. There's no way you could treat gay people as if they were not committing a terrible illegal act. There's no way. And yet all those things were pulled apart within a couple of generations, and pulled apart just through people's will, really, and it can be done again.
When you went to buy your first house with Deborah, your partner, how'd that go? That wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, that was 1983. So I think one of the things about using a lot of the official timelines is things can look as if they changed. So, the Whitlam government is obviously very significant, and they do a lot. And people look at the past and think it's all sort of Woodstock and Whitlam. It's all change. And a lot of those changes really don't get down to the suburbs for a long time. So it's true that I think from somewhere quite early, like 1971, there are some cases in which some banks, maybe Westpac Bank of New South Wales are giving some women loans. And so that then gets written up in the official history as women getting loans. They're not really in practice. So in our case, we had saved up for a little flat, and we go into the Commonwealth Bank in Martin Place in Sydney. And Deborah's got real savings, and I've got quite a good job as a cadet journalist at Fairfax. And they take all our facts and figures, but then with all of what Deborah earns, they discount it entirely. They won't take a penny. This is 1983. They won't take a penny of her money into account, her earnings, because, full marks for observation and all that, the bank manager has noticed she's a woman. And as a woman, of course, once you give her a roof under which to fall pregnant, she will inevitably fall pregnant and inevitably will then leave her employment. So you just
This is in the 80s.
This is 1983. We went downstairs and Deborah closed her account and I did too. And we did go to a credit union and they gave us a loan. So this is the sort of point where it's starting to change. When you're a married woman at this time, credit cards come in the mid-70s. Before then, though, people had store cards like David Jones cards or Grace Brothers cards, Myer cards. But they had to be handed back when you were married, of course.
What do you mean?
And then you get a new card, with your husband's permission.
Right. With your husband's permission?
Yeah, that's right. But you can't have a card on your own cognizance.
What about women who were in...
A lot of men believe that rule should be brought back, but that's an argument for another day.
You're talking to the wrong audience here, Richard. What if women were in violent marriages? Rape within marriage was legal until when? Like ridiculously recently.
1981. It differs from...
Rape didn't exist within marriage.
It differs from state to state. In fact, some states were later, actually. I think what surprised me about the rape and marriage law is that it's the subject of a real debate. Again, it's not something that's just on the statute books that's been ignored and let's get round to fixing it. In 1981 in New South Wales, it's the subject of a big debate in Macquarie Street in the state parliament, and you've got people really arguing about it and saying...
What were their arguments?
They say John Dowd, who later became a Supreme Court judge, he was leader of the opposition at the time. Ross Cameron's father, the famous Ross Cameron of today, his father was in Parliament as well.
Apple doesn't fall far.
And they're saying, look, of course rape is terrible in marriage, but if it were to happen, then you've got to give people the ability to try to repair this terrible fault of rape, and for the law to intercede would stop, and marriage is more important. That was their argument. 1981.
Suddenly they were in the bedroom. They were using justification of being in the bedroom a couple of decades earlier, where you needed the photographs of the adultery, and if there was no proof, then it didn't happen. And now it's like, but the courts shouldn't be involved in the bedroom.
Yes, you can't go in the bedroom unless it's a gay person.
Or unless it benefits, man, exactly, or it's a gay person.
That's right, yeah. So it was interceding between a man and his wife in the sanctity of the married bedroom.
Unless it's a gay person, in which case not only do you go in there, but they go to jail.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
That's right. So, we could talk about it being Indigenous too, and I know people will say, well, that is a hard road to hoe now, being Indigenous in Australia. And that is true. But again, don't forget how bad it was, that it was even worse. There's there's a lot in the book about this, but I'll just tell one more slightly humorous thing, because there's not much humorous in that chapter. But in 1967, they make a film called Journey into Darkness. And it's the first film with Aboriginal characters in the central roles. Now, that's got to be good, doesn't it? 1967. It's about an Indigenous crook and an Indigenous tracker, and it's all set in Alice. Marvellous. Well, they didn't quite get round to casting Indigenous people in the roles of the two Indigenous men. One's played by Kamal.
Stop it.
And the other is played by Ed Devereaux, the father from Skippy, in blackface. And whenever you research a book like this, they always come across some little detail that you're quite pleased with. In this book, I came across the fact that attending the premiere of this movie was the last official act by Harold Holt before that fateful day. Now, some people say he was picked up by Chinese submarines. I say he was swimming for freedom. Get me out of here.
Away from this shocker.
Get me out of here.
What about school? What about the idea, lots said today, that parents are too involved in schools, parents take the side of of their children
Yes.
over everyone else, and that's a bad thing for the education system.
Well, I think that is true.
Let's play shock a millennial.
That's right, yeah.
What was school like in the 60s and the 70s?
Yeah, look, I think parents are too involved now, and my Johnny is always right. But in this time, my Johnny is always wrong, and no one's going to listen to the child. It is a kind of weird environment. The punishments are kind of strange and unnatural. There's a lot of things where one person's told me something, and I really don't believe it. And so I've gone out and quite assiduously asked a whole lot of people.
What's an example of that?
In primary school, really common. I think particularly in Catholic primary schools for some reason, at least all the examples I've come across are in Catholic ones. A boy misbehaving is taken upstairs and forced to dress as a girl, including a wig, and then come back and paraded in front of the girls who duly laugh at him. And then he has to sit all the day in girls' clobber and the girls' wear. And there's a wig and a dress kept for that. There's a story in the book about two little children, and they've been spitting in the playground, which is not great. And so they're given a bucket and told they've got to fill the bucket full of spit before they're allowed to come back into the class. So they're 6 years old or something. And of course, after a while they realise
you can't do that.
It's an impossible task. And so by the time they're let back in the class 50 minutes, they're absolutely sobbing and distraught. There's underpant inspections all the time.
Oh, yeah.
So the girls are, and I think in the more progressive schools, this is probably the girls flicking the dress to one side to allow the teacher to assess whether
she was wearing the correct
colour and style. I've heard lots of stories about schools in which they happen to have a set of metal staircases, which you could see up through, and they would station the prefects underneath, and they would examine the younger girls as they came down the stairs. I mean, you'd be arrested.
And even caning seems...
Oh, well, lots of caning, yeah.
But like when you think about that, imagine telling someone today, well, yes, my teacher just hit me with a big stick.
Yeah. Yeah. No, people are caned all the time. And lots of stories about people being caned. I mean, this didn't happen in my school. We got caned.
Did you ever get the cane?
Yeah, I got caned all the time, but always for smoking. So, it clearly didn't work because I kept on getting caned for the same crime. A lot of people telling me stories about first day, year 9 or something, and the teacher would cane all of them and say, 3 on the hand for each of the 100 kids in the form, just so you know. And the guy who told me that actually, who's a teacher himself now, and I said, 100, 300, gee, you must have been fit, ha ha ha. I said it in a sort of manner of levity. This guy's my age, right? And he wasn't taking any levity about it. He said, no, don't laugh, don't joke about it.
Yeah.
Don't joke about it. He was malevolent. He was a bastard, And the herd of
that's
these...
someone who's quite sick, who gets pleasure.
Exactly. The herd of these things still plays with these...
And what you say about children not being believed, like the two little kids who were spitting in the bucket or the kid who had to wear the uniform, would come home and their parents would probably say, oh, serves you right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And is that what you mean about...
And the parents, there was a very big thing of don't get too big for your boots. It was one of the sort of classic expressions of the time. And there were variants of it, but no one likes a big noter. No one Mum, I got 99 out of 100 for maths. What did you lose the 1 mark for? Gee, you must, you better work harder. And again, the parents kind of thought they were doing everyone a favour by saying this all the time, but it really was this sort of constant putting you in your place all the time. And once you got to work, of course, the workplace was structured in a very similar way, really.
Does that mean that generation is better suited to a workplace than perhaps millennials who are always told, you're amazing, you're amazing? I do it myself as a parent, great listening, good sharing, great thinking. And that doesn't happen when you get into a workforce. And I've seen a lot of millennials struggle with that.
I guess so, but, feeling positive about yourself is a pretty good thing. And if you're not going to be told by your own parent that you're good, again, all these things you can probably go too far in the other direction. Of course you can, and you need to praise the action rather than the child. I think actually that's a good effort you've put in. Actually praise the effort rather than some genius. You don't want to praise genius without effort, actually. But no, I think it was a very authoritarian workplace at the time. In which, I mean, I start the book really with this moment in our office at the ABC in Sydney, and my millennial producer is giving me notes, and I'm writing them down with my pen, and my pen runs out of ink, and I hold the pen up in the air so I can see through the casing, and I say, "Oh, that's good. It's actually run out of ink. I'll be able to get a new one." And Mariam, I'm just sort of kidding around for no one's pleasure but my own, really. And Mariam says, "What do you mean? What does that mean?" And I have to explain to her that in the workplace of the 1980s, when I first joined the work, there is no such thing as an unlocked stationery cupboard. Nowhere in the country is there an unlocked stationery cupboard. When your pen runs out, you have to go to some quite senior person in the office, show them that it's actually run out of ink, at which point they will issue a new one. Same thing with pencils. You can't sharpen your own pencil.
Why not?
Well, you might sharpen it too much.
You might waste some.
You might waste some. You take it to a person who's got this big pencil sharpener bolted to the desk, and she or he will sharpen it for you, and then adjudged when it's so low you can get a same thing with.
So what happens when it gets down near the bottom and it gets really short?
Well, on the radio when we talked about this, let me tell the story this way. So I say all this stuff, and Mariam says that's rubbish. That cannot be true. And so I say, great thing about talkback radio, let's ask the listeners. So Mariam's being the producer, sitting on the chair with the headphones, and I tell my story about the pen, and I say to her, am I just telling her a story? Or is it true? And instantly the switchboard, vroom, 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 and a million people ring up and say, "Oh yeah, the pencil thing, absolutely, the pen thing." A lady, the first caller said, "And what about the carbon paper? When you finish," she was a stenographer or something.
Yeah, typing.
Yeah. When you finished a piece of carbon paper, you take that up, and she would look through, hold against the light, look through, and say, "Oh, come on, love, you can get a few more goes out of there." And the next guy rings up and says, "Absolutely right." He says, "I was a wool broker, and we also used to use pencils. And you weren't allowed to sharpen them yourself, and you weren't allowed to just get a new one." And he said when it got right down to a stub, he would take it to the front, and the office manager would look at it, and if it really was a stub, she would reach into a drawer underneath her desk and bring out this little metal sleeve, which she'd put
like a little extension.
Put over the stub so you could get another day's work out of it.
Wow.
And I said to everyone, "Oh, was this just a more frugal time?" And all the listeners said, no. It was about authority. It was about saying, "I'm the boss, you're the worker.
Oh.
Know your place. You have no power here."
Right. So when you say, back to what you were saying about it was a paradise for pedophiles, that idea of complete authority, whether it was the priest, the teacher, the boarding master, is that how they were able to get away with it, as we've seen in this Royal Commission?
Yeah, I think so. That's right.
Because you didn't question authority.
It's a very authoritarian time. It's a time when it's really difficult to be different in any way. I think that's the most noticeable thing about the period. There are some delights about this period in terms of, there's no social media, there's none of that level of anxiety. It's relatively easy to consider yourself having a successful life. I think these days the definition of a successful life has become more complicated, and back then it really was a matter of if you can possibly buy the house and pay it off and not be in prison, that's pretty good.
Well done you.
Well done you. So there are lots of things that are a kind of simpler time in a good way, but there's an awful lot of parts of this story which are, life generally is not a smorgasbord. It's a straitjacket in the Australia of this time.
When you had kids and became a parent, you quote someone in the book about saying if you had enough glasses of cask wine, you could almost forget you had kids.
Yeah.
Because back then when we were growing up, you were a parent. You didn't parent. It wasn't a verb. And I think possibly that's been the biggest cultural shift when to parent became a verb instead of just a noun. When you became a parent, did you consciously parent differently to the way you were brought up, or did you consciously parent in opposition to that?
Well, you know what? This is more about flesh wounds than this book.
Yeah.
But I think one of the really defiant things about flesh wounds is really about the fact that to have inadequate parenting in this period was really common. And
it's like benign neglect, wasn't it?
Yes, and to understand how common it was is to understand that you've got no right to feel especially aggrieved if you weren't parented well. It was really common, and most of us got over it. And we got over it by finding the love elsewhere.
And having
children
therapy.
And therapy and a glass of cask wine, maybe. And there's no need to feel that your life is doomed. And there's certainly no need to feel that your parenting is doomed. One of the really sort of strong things I wanted to say in Flesh Wounds is just because you didn't have good parents yourself doesn't mean you can't be a fine parent. And lots of people do it. And in fact, I think one of the almost ambitions of life is to turn darkness into light. If you've been given some darkness in your life, in whatever form, the parenting you got or a disease you were afflicted by or whatever, and you can somehow find a way of turning that darkness into light and handing over something better than you've received, then that's the meaning of life. And lots of people do it.
I often worry that we are the first generation to parent in a world so dramatically different from our own childhood because of technology. And it's said that you only call it technology if it wasn't invented before you were born. Like our kids don't refer to technology very often because it's just the world. The world. Like we don't refer to electricity as technology. I look back and think, and I know a lot about technology, but it's hard not to feel out of your depth, isn't it? Because like we're parenting with a blindfold.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I also do think it's a myth that this is. People say all the time, there's no period of history which has endured more change than our own. I really don't think that is true.
Right.
You could cite a million other periods where it's been. Imagine the difference between the Australia of 1870 and the Australia of 1890. The telex has come along. You previously would not know that there's been a Napoleonic War for 3 months until the ships came.
Yeah, right. So they probably said back in the olden days where we could just get on with our lives.
This is a radical difference. If you read something like Cider with Rosie, the great book by Laurie Lee, is set in the Dorset or the Cornwall of just before the First World War. Imagine. And it's an England without planes, without cars, without shops, it's an entirely rural place that really is probably unchanged for centuries. And then by maybe 1925, all of that has come, courtesy of the First World War mostly. It's a time of amazing change. I sometimes think about, my father grows up in the north of England just before the Second World War. So it's really those towns in the north of England, they really didn't have, the motor cars around, of course it is, but mostly people are walking or bicycle. There's a lot of biking going on. There's no cars. There's no telephones. There's a telex. It's an incredibly different world to the world than I grow up in. So I don't think it's true that this is a time of unbelievable change. It's a period of significant change. But really, for the last couple of centuries, it's always been. Imagine being living in one of those rural settings in Britain before the Industrial Revolution. So how much your life is changing between So when's the steam engine come along? Sort of 1790. So imagine the difference between 1660 and 1790. You and your family are sort of pulled into these factories belching smoke, and suddenly you find yourself part of an industrial economy, being paid a wage and living in these hovels, in these sort of workers' barracks, really, having been on the farm a few years before. Well, that's 1760s or something.
Do you think millennials will look back on the 2000s and just go, that was when it was really great?
That was when it was good.
MySpace.
Yes. Look, I think part of the reason for going, obviously part of the reason for going back is just to shock the millennials, to take pleasure. Because when millennials look at baby boomers like me, they look with quite justified contempt. They say, you've destroyed the environment, you've destroyed the labour market, you've destroyed the housing market. They're bitter for good reason. And reading this book is one way, or having bits of the book read out to them, is one way to say, to that wonderful look that came on Mariam's face after the pens. Sympathy, maybe even pity. It was tougher. I think they have an image that life was really easy because you could buy a house, and it's true that people could buy a house. But life was quite difficult in a whole series of other ways. It was quite an impoverished time. I think that's one of the things that almost surprised me when I went back there. People haven't got a lot of money. The huge growth in income in Australia really happens in the 90s.
Yeah, the
It's
80s,
Hawke deregulates everything and allows trade, and it's that real end of protectionism that drives this huge increase in Australian incomes. Before then, people who, even middle-class columnists of the time, like Ross Campbell, are writing a lot about hire purchase and about, you don't buy a TV. No one buys it. Even quite wealthy people don't buy a TV, or they rent it, and often it's sent back after the Olympics or the football final, or what. The fridges are bought on hire purchase, and when you make your final payment, the department store sends you a certificate. So you've done it, fantastic.
It's like Afterpay.
Yeah,
Hire purchase was Afterpay.
I suppose so. That's right, yeah. There's some nice research done by an academic in Melbourne who's looked at all the photographs that the migrants send back home, and this statistically wild proportion of them, they're photographed in front of their fridge with the fridge door open, so they can say to the people back home, look what we've achieved. We've got a fridge. The fridge has got milk in it.
And that was enough.
Yeah. Half the houses haven't got sewage, I mean, in 1972, when the Whitlam government comes in, 70% of the houses in Perth, for instance, don't have sewage. Pretty similar, maybe 50% of those. Whitlam says at the end of, when asked in 75 what he achieved, he says among all the other things, conscription, he says, I came and found half of Sydney unsewered and I left it fully flushed. It's funny, isn't it? So there's no sewage. Most people don't have a phone. Phones are really quite hard to come by. You've got to go on a waiting list, and often if the exchange is not good enough, they'll say no. You cannot. People try to bribe their way to it.
And single women couldn't get contraception.
Yeah, so Australia is one of the first countries in the world to allow the contraceptive pill. And again, people don't necessarily look at the fine print of that because it was only married women, and we were actually quite one of the last where single women could. Obviously, there were a few I think there was quite a lot of under the counter pill prescribing,
which is so counterintuitive if you think about it. You know, it's like the married women needed it to be able to control the size of their family, but single women were still presumed and expected to not be having sex. Yeah,
that's right. No, that's absolutely right. So this is sort of image again of the swinging 60s. But there's some a quote in the book from a Sydney gynaecologist who. Now I've forgotten his numbers, but he says he's interviewed 300 women in his practice, and he says only 3 of them know where their clitoris is.
Wow.
Most of them, he says, the vast don't really understand how their bodies work. And that's in 1975. He gives evidence to there's this weird thing called the Royal Commission into Human Relationships, which is commissioned by the Whitlam government, and Anne Devison and others take the evidence. But a lot of the evidence to that is just about the fact that,
And that's why women's magazines actually had such a place. You talk about the Women's Weekly, but also Dolly Doctor and Cleo.
Yes, that's right.
That was the only place that information was available. It wasn't going to be in the newspaper. It wasn't going to be on the radio. That was the only place that you could find that information.
Censorship is heavy, depending on exactly when. I mean, it starts to. This is really in the earlier period rather than in the 70s, but censorship is intense. So you can't get Portnoy's Complaint or Lady Chatterley's. Lady Chatterley's Lover is published in England by this point. It's still banned here because Menzies says he can't stand the idea of Dame Patty, his wife, reading it, so it's banned. Hilariously, there's a quite sober academic treatise on the Lady Chatterley trial in London, which is also banned lest Australians go through the evidence and manage to piece together the plot of the book. James, is it Ulysses? Yeah, I think it's Ulysses is banned here, but there's a film that comes out and that's banned as well. In New Zealand, now they must have been very progressive. They allowed the film, but only if it was screened in gender-specific cinemas. So the men could only watch it in the Royal and the women could watch it in the, the Central. God knows whether these sex-crazed crowds met afterwards. I don't know.
Did you finish feeling more or less optimistic?
I felt very optimistic because we've managed to do it. We managed to change all of this. And as I say, I think it's to look at the past through rose-coloured glasses and think it was marvellous then and we have collectively let the place run down and go to the dogs. A, that really isn't true. But B, what a depressing report card on all of us. Actually, we've taken this frightened monoculture and left it in a place where it is not perfect, but it is one of the most outward-looking, most culturally interesting, most ethnically diverse. 43% of people in Sydney speak a language other than English at home. This is from the standing start of the White Australia policy not so long ago. So it's a story of, I think, of this immense Australian desire for change and to move forward, and an understanding that having done so much of it, we can do it some more.
And I hope John and Lindsay got married in the last year.
I hope they were very happy.
Yeah. Well, who imagined saying to John and Lindsay when they had to move to South Australia, one day you're going to be able to get married.
Yeah, imagine that. And yet it happened in our Australia.
In our Australia, the land before avocado. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Mia.
I hope you loved this episode of No Filter as much as I did. And if you'd like to hear more from Richard, you can get even more of an insight into him if you scroll back through the feed to hear my first ever interview that we did. It was a couple of years ago. He'd just released a book. It was a memoir, and it was about his childhood, his very complicated relationship with his own mother, about what it was like for him growing up in the 70s. And he also spoke about his amazing long-term relationship with his partner, Deborah Oswald, who is an extraordinary playwright, and she also is the writer and creator of Offspring. Find his book, The Land Before Avocado, and all of his books at any good bookstore or at apple.co/Mamamia. And you can read an extract from Richard's book on mamamia.com.au. We've got a link in the show notes. And if you like this show, please tell someone who might enjoy it, and also leave a review for us in Apple Podcasts. It helps more people find out about the show. No Filter is produced by Liza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, also known as Mrs. Jason Levine. Not really. I will see you on Mamamia.